Good afternoon, everyone. I think we ought to start taking the future seriously. And I'm going to start by talking about the past. This is a town called Ramsbottom in Lancashire. Most of you won't have heard of it. But this is the Silicon Valley of the Industrial Revolution. In this valley, new technologies like the flying shuttle, the spinning jenny, the mule were invented, and the Lancashire cotton industry was born, and that was the engine, one of the engines of the Industrial Revolution in Britain. And I grew up here in the 1960s and 70s. My dad and my uncles worked as spinners and dyers. My mum and my aunties worked as weavers. I love the set design because it takes me back to my roots. Now, if you look closely at the photograph, one of the things that might strike you about it is that it's a town built by the Victorians. The housing is Victorian. The mills, the warehouses, the chapels that you can see in the middle distance. The railway runs down the valley bottom, you can't see that, but the Victorians built it. And the town hall is hidden behind the trees. They built that too. This is true of all of our towns and cities. The housing, the schools, the libraries, the art galleries, the town halls, the museums, the railways, the roads, the bridges, the bits that you can't see because they're underground, the water and sewage systems. In 1859, the Great Stink in London led Joseph Bazalgette to propose a sewage system that we're still using. It cost £250 billion at least in today's money. It took some years to build. But he built 150 years' worth of capacity, and we're only now having to extend the amount of it. The railways, Isambard, Kingdom, Brunel built the rail link and the bridges that still connect London to the West Country. So the Victorians built all of that and built it to last a century or more. They built lots of invisible infrastructure too. If you look in the top left-hand corner of the photograph, you can just about see Peel Tower, a memorial to Sir Robert Peel, who invented the police force. The Victorians invented trade unions, cooperatives, mutual societies like the building societies, the idea of free public education. They created the joint stock company so that capital could be raised to invest in those cotton mills. They even gave us some of our moral framework. I grew up drinking drinks called things like dandelion and burdock and sarsaparilla because of the temperance movement and the chapels in this northern mill town, Jeanette Winterson territory. My mother did courses at the Workers' Education Association. That whole movement of workers' self-improvement came about from the Victorians. So the point of all of this is that if you're building something that's going to last for 100 years or 150 years, you're building it for other people, because you're not going to be around by then. And equally, if you're not thinking about other people, you're not building for the future. Now, the economy we have now is, of course, very different from the economy the Victorians had. It's much more complicated. And this is a visualization from the Atlas of Economic Complexity of what the UK economy looks like. And what it's telling us is actually about the complexity, the number of products and services in a modern economy, and the links, the trade links between all these different products. Because we live in a world, an economy where everything is made everywhere. It's true of the electronic gadgets we all have. Precious was just talking to us about smartphones. They have components that might have been designed in California and assembled in China, but they have components that come from at least a dozen different countries that go into them. But something much simpler, like a shirt, is made in many different countries. The fabric from Bangladesh, the buttons from Cambodia, the thread from Vietnam, all put together in China and shipped to a high street store near you. And what that means is that we're all dependent on distant strangers. We are everything that we buy is made everywhere. And that's always been the case. Adam Smith wrote about it when he wrote about the wealth of nations. He gave a very famous example of the pin factory, where if workers divided up the tasks involved in making a pin among themselves and each specialised, they would make many more. They'd be much more productive than if one worker had to make a whole pin from start to finish. And he called it the division of labour. And that division of labour is now massively more extensive. It crosses borders so that the specialisation into different tasks is split between different people in different countries. And we have this incredibly complex web of transactions that has driven the prosperity that we enjoy today. The thing is, we're not very good at understanding how it all works. The data that make this visualization is pretty new, and we don't have a really good idea of the statistics that describe this new economy. We're good at calculating what different nations do, national economic statistics. We know what happens inside different companies, but we're not very good at understanding or measuring the connections between us. But that's okay, because neither did the Victorians. This is a page from an abstract of statistics for 1871 to 1885. And it explains in great detail all sorts of figures about agricultural statistics. You can find out the price of seeds of clover and flax. You can find out how much tallow was used in making candles. You can look up how much linen and beer was shipped from Ireland to England. You can even find out the imports of the teeth of elephants and seahorses. I'm not making this up, they're in there. And of the 112 pages, there are 5 pages describing mines and factories and canals and railways. And this was the height of the Industrial Revolution, the dark satanic mills. The statistics lagged behind what was going on in the economy. Now, we think of the Victorians as being like Dickens' Mr. Gradgrind, I want facts, only facts. But actually, they knew that something remarkable was going on in their world, in their economy. And you get a much better idea of their understanding of it by looking at something like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which was inspired by early experiments in electricity. She read a report of a galvanism experiment conducted on the fresh corpse of an executed prisoner, and it caused the body to raise its arm and move its legs, and that gave birth to Frankenstein. And the Gothic imagination gives you a much better sense of what they felt about what they saw happening around them than did Dickens' Mr. Gradgrind, just as we now have our zombies and our hostile artificial intelligence. So they knew what was going on, even if the statistics didn't capture it. So how do we make sense of what's going on now with us? Well, we know something. I am an economist, so there's one chart. It's the only one. And what I want you to look at in this chart is the gap between the black line, which is GDP, and the dashed line at the bottom, which is the material used in creating that GDP. It's literally the mass of the economy, how much the economy weighs. Now, they've both gone down recently because of the recession and the financial crisis, but the striking thing about that chart is the gap between declining consumption, declining use of stuff, and the increase in GDP over that period. So what it tells us is that the economic growth that we experienced measured by GDP over that time period was all intangible stuff. Well, not stuff at all, it was just all intangible value. And that's what GDP measures. There are lots of things that GDP doesn't measure. One of the things it doesn't measure is the variety of products and services available now. It would count just as good all of us wearing exactly the same pair of shoes as all of us wearing a different pair of shoes. 3 spoons are just as good for GDP as a knife, a fork, and a spoon, but the value in the variety is obviously much greater. So it doesn't count any of that much greater variety in the economy. It's a very bad measure of innovation as well. Nathan Mayer Rothschild died in 1836 of an infected abscess on his tooth. He was the richest man in the world at the time. You can only imagine what he might have paid for an antibiotic that would cost a few pounds now, but they hadn't been invented yet. Even apparently trivial innovations are incredibly valuable to people. And one of my favourite examples comes from a TV programme that was broadcast in 1999 called The 1900 House. The programme took an ordinary family back to live as if they were living in 1900. And the woman, and it was of course the woman, had to do much more work. She had to cook all the food from scratch. She had to spend days washing, a day to heat up the water, a day to wash, a day to dry, a day to iron, and so on. She had to make all the children's clothes by hand. The thing that nearly made her give up the experiment was that she couldn't get her hair clean because shampoo hadn't been invented. That seems very trivial. There are, of course, masses of innovations that have occurred since 1900. All the electronic gadgets that we use, all the medicines that have transformed our lives, all the trivial things like the shirts that you don't have to iron, all the different flavours of breakfast cereal, masses of innovation, not all of which is captured in GDP. And we know that GDP is not a great measure. We know that it counts the illegal drugs trade, and it counts things that cause pollution as being good, and it doesn't count caring for your children at home, and it doesn't count volunteering, so we know that. But it's really bad at capturing all the digital activities, and digital is, of course, the steam or the electricity of our day. So all those free activities online, the blogs that you can read, Wikipedia, Skype calls, all of that free stuff isn't being measured by GDP. And there's an awful lot of that digital activity that's going on. So the question is, if it's intangible, and actually intangible value can evaporate very quickly, as we've seen in many cases, if it's intangible and we don't count it very well, how on earth are we going to figure out how we ought to be building value in this economy? How are we going to make this economy better? And I don't know the answer to that. I don't know how to count all the connections, but I think we should start with the people. One of the things that we should be counting is all of the time that people are putting into building these online digital activities, and all of the time and enjoyment that people get out of using all of these activities. This is a map of the internet, and the striking thing about it is how similar it is to the map of the economy that I showed you earlier. Because the important thing about capitalism isn't the capital, it's the connections. It's all about these connections between people. And that's the message I want to leave you with today, that whatever you're doing, make sure that you're doing it for other people in other places, because that's how you know that you're building it for the future and not just for now. And I think we need to start taking the future seriously. Thank you.